ISR Matrix was specifically developed and designed around law enforcement, state and federal law enforcement. It was essentially how to apprehend, control, and transport a subject. The thing is, we developed this in the mid-90s. So as we were developing it, the issue was we had been doing, by we meaning everybody that was around at the time, was learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, had come into America, and a lot of the traditional martial arts we were practicing, we saw all the weaknesses in it. And those of us that had done some quote-unquote classical martial arts that are still modern today, like boxing and judo and wrestling, which I had done, still had weaknesses compared to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We were being impressed with this new way of fighting and this new martial art that had entered America. We were also dealing with that we could see that it had maybe weaknesses. It wasn't a striking art per se, but it was really muffling the striking arts. And then when we were really training it at the time, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu allowed for striking. So we'd wrestle with slaps to the faces and strikes. So what is now called modern martial arts at the time was Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It really was. So as a martial artist, I had a facility and I had a lot of police officers that were training at my facility. And they wanted to learn how to do this stuff, but they didn't want to train with civilians. They had specific questions they were asking me. So we started separate days, just law enforcement, Friday evenings, Saturdays after class. Law enforcement officers would come in and say, all right, well, let's keep doing the same thing, but let's put our duty belts on. Let's put the red and blue guns, the plastic firearms. Let's put, rubber knives. Let's put different things in our tools and see what would happen. And then again, we bruised egos, bruised bodies, a couple cracked ribs. We went at it really hard, where one person was trying to arrest someone who didn't want to be arrested. And usually that person was allowed to hit first and strike first. Then the officer would have to escalate accordingly. The thing is, officers have a use of force spectrum of what they can do depending on what the subject does. And the traditional defensive tactics at the time were based around wrist locks and restraints that would work on a civil person that was maybe drunk, but at some point was going to yield. The thing is, if the person was really upset or on drugs or really violent, the only choice was to break a wrist if you can even get to the wrist, and then you'd have to fight anyway. So the first thing that happened was these officers felt much more confident about their own survivability in a fight. They felt, they could wrestle the person down, they could use quote-unquote Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or aspects of it and get their arrest done. The issue was that they couldn't translate it over to their departments. In other words, there's this thing there that's just come into America. It's called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If we get into a use of force where the person's violent, we can use this to subdue them and get our arrest. But how do you translate that? Because there's no way you can go to a police department and say, can we get the whole entire agency and department to go take this stuff and go train it? And that's what we were all saying, just come take more classes. But again, that doesn't work that way. Departments have all sorts of legalities they got to go through. There's an entire use of force. You got officers that are brand new rookies. You got officers that are about to retire. There's injuries in some officers. And the bottom line is, and I still believe this, police departments and state and federal law shouldn't say they use a martial art or a martial system, because then they're basically confined to that system. If the system changes, then what are they left with? Police forces and law enforcement agencies have to deal with the law, our constitution, or in this case, any country's legal system. So as police officers, that's what they are. They're law enforcement officers. They're not martial artists. They're not combat sports athletes. So we learned right away within the first 2 years that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu wasn't going to be it. Because law enforcement is a vertical thing, and they have to talk to people, and they have to grab the people and transport them initially. And if they resist, they can only escalate to a certain degree. And they just can't get a body lock, or they can't just slam them to the ground or throw a strike at them if they're going to use any strikes. They have to be able to speak upon exactly what they did after the fact in their police reports, then in court. So we were challenged with a lot of things early on. And I myself wasn't a police officer. Even before I opened up my facility, going back into the 70s as a child, where there wasn't that many martial arts programs for kids, if you were lucky enough to start a martial arts program, it was usually taught by police officers or military vets, and they allowed a few kids in that behaved accordingly. They were very strict programs, and that's kind of where I started. So by the time I had my own facility, I understood that, and I understood where they were at, and I knew that I had to bring some kind of overlying use of force to what they were doing, and it didn't apply to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I couldn't bring it in where they could speak on and use, I couldn't combine the two worlds. So I thought about, what is it that police officers have to do worldwide, state and federal? Well, they have to intercede when there's a problem. They get called to intercede. There's either a domestic dispute or a fight or some issue where the law has to be applied, and they are that force of the law. So when they get there, obviously all legal aspects are reinforced by power. In other words, if you continue to refuse, someone's going to get there and make you stop doing what you're doing. And that is the role of the police officer. In the end, that's the role. If they get there and they can speak through it and they can communicate orders and the person listens, fantastic. But in the end, if you're going to push it, it's going to be a physical confrontation. So they have to use an entire means of force to explain what they're doing. So I said, well, they intercede. So they're intercepting something that's already going on. So if they drive up and there's a crime being committed, they're interceding, they're intercepting what's happening. And I started using that word intercept because that's exactly what they do. They get in the middle of something and they have to approach. So I started thinking, what techniques are valid in that approach? The verbal's there. That's the entire history of speaking verbally and how to do it, and they get trained to do that at the academy. The problem is at the academy level, especially back then, the defensive tactics didn't match up. Once it went physical, they weren't there. So I started thinking, what techniques and tactics in modern sports address this intercepting once they got to grab the person and put their hands on them, grab the wrist, grab the shoulder, to transport them. Essentially, they don't want to wrestle you. They just want to grab you and move you someplace where they're going to handcuff you. So I started looking at wrestling and I started looking at things like that. And then if it went further than that and the person was resisting grabs, essentially grabs by the police officer, they would have to grab the body. And so what sports, what combat sports, what traditional martial arts went from grabbing the wrist and grabbing the limbs, which is what I looked at. I looked at both traditional and modern martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and everything else. Where would it go from controlling the limbs to the body? And then I started looking at, well, if they're not wearing much fabric, there's judo, there's sambo, and there's many other arts that address controlling the body, and once it's at the torso. And then obviously if they're wearing clothing to some degree, depending on where they live, there'd be judo, and again, sambo would be for controlling the fabric. And then I said, well, everything we've done for like 2 or 3 years and where we go with all this stuff wrestling at the facility with this gear would be, it ends up on the ground. And then obviously Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was phenomenal. It just had all this to offer. And then obviously from all the Western side was wrestling. So I started thinking, well, those would be probably the two main factors once it hit the ground on getting the officer to have a positional dominance on the subject and still be able to monitor their environment, which still be those two sports have pinning, and those two sports have a point system that it shows where you're in a dominant position. So I said, that's great. Then I was like, okay, well, if they're interceding, they're intercepting. And when they get there, they're still intercepting by grabbing the wrist. Because again, if I'm being passive and they grab my wrist and say, come this way, and I listen to them, they've intercepted. But what they've really done conceptually for me was they've stabilized me a little bit. I was irate, I was refusing, I was yelling at them, and they intercepted and they grabbed my wrist. And at that point, maybe I back away. I've been stabilized to some degree. And if I comply and they don't have to go any further, situation was resolved. If I continued to resist within that frame of mind, well, to be stabilized, they'd have to manipulate that limb, that joint, and then they could probably still use traditional martial arts for that and get me handcuffed, good to go. If I resisted beyond that point though, they would have to use, like I said, the torso, more of the torso, get to the torso. There's wrestling, there's some judo, and there's other arts we can talk about later, but they would use those things. And as long as I was vertical and resisted enough to get me back again to that handcuffing position, they would go from that stability of the body towards the resolution of the handcuffing. So if that makes sense, there was, in my eyes, an intercept phase. And if that was refused, then there had to be a stabilization phase where they had to stabilize the situation enough where they can continue doing verbal commands, telling me what to do, and if I continue to continue to refuse rather, they'd have to resolve. They'd have to go to a higher state. So depending if I struck them or didn't strike them, they'd be allowed to do it legally. But let's just stick to the concepts. They went from an intercept to a stabilize, but what if we fell to the ground? Well, to continue to stabilize me on the ground, that's where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling would really come into play. That's probably the best way to control me. And by controlling me, stabilize the whole situation. They were destabilizing my efforts and stabilizing their efforts. And then if it got resolved on the ground, that would be, again, handcuffing or another officer getting on the scene and helping them handcuffed. So that strategic perspective, we call it a strategic point of view, ended up being something that we ended up saying, or I coined as intercept, stabilize, resolve. So by coining it that way, I was like, okay, the acronym would be ISR. And then as I started plugging it back and forth where they intercepted, okay, so I fought back a little bit, they stabilized, but I broke free, they'd have to re-intercept. And if they intercept and stabilize and then we're about to resolve and I broke from resolution, well, those steps backwards would be they'd have to re-stabilize to resolve. Or if they lost their resolution and they lost their stability, they'd have to intercept again, stabilize, and resolve. So that back and forth thing became a matrix because we were plugging in techniques that fit into those moments that were conceptual. In the interception phase, we developed the best way, what were the best techniques in that interception phase. We developed the best techniques and tactics that were great for that stability phase, the stabilization phase. And then for the resolution, the same thing. What were the best techniques and tactics for that resolution phase? Along with those techniques and tactics, there had to be verbal commands. Along with those verbal commands, there had to be a strategic perspective that they could keep. That way, later on, when they wrote the reports, they could not only describe what went on physically, but what they were saying by speech that would match the legal use of force spectrum used in their state or their department or in their country. And I realized I was onto something there. I realized that I was developing something that didn't have a place, that's something that could be used to educate new rookie police officers, that could be used to train, so physically train police officers. So it's not educate the administrators alone, not educate in a way that you could be writing in a manual, but to actually physically train them. So you don't just throw them in the deep end of the water. This is how you train it from the shallow end to the deep end. So that was the training method. Then that was the hard part is, well, we've got the means to educate them. We've got the means to train them. How do we get them to a performance level where they're out there in the street and working their job, but they don't look like a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy or a judo guy or a wrestler or a boxer, because that's not good. At the time, there wasn't even cameras filming them. But later on, we realized that's not good on camera. Back then, we realized that's not good with witnesses in a court of law. You just can't do those things. So we needed something, and I mean by we, meaning the police officers and myself, we needed a way to combine all that. So what I came up with is that the name Intercept, Stabilize, Resolve, because they got it. So when we were wrestling and trying to fight each other with all that, we started calling it out to one another. We started saying what phase we were in. Then we started calling the tactics to each other, and it became a language on Fridays and Saturdays.